At 01:40 a.m., the artillery stopped. On the Eastern Front in February 1943, this was never a sign of peace. Silence did not mean safety. It meant something was wrong. The sector south of Voronezh had changed hands repeatedly since January. After the collapse of German forces at Stalingrad, the front line did not move cleanly westward. It fractured. Units were split, reassigned, merged, dissolved, and reassembled under pressure. Maps lagged behind reality by days. Orders arrived late, or not at all. Men slept where they collapsed. That night, the temperature was officially recorded at 29 degrees Celsius. Some veterans later insisted it was colder. Wind speed hovered between 2 and 3 meters per second, enough to bite exposed skin, but not enough to carry sound. Snow had fallen steadily for hours, building a soft, uneven layer between 18 and 25 centimeters deep across the trenches and open ground. Visibility was poor. A low, drifting fog pressed close to the ground, reducing sightlines to no more than 70-80 meters. The forest line to the east was barely visible, a darker smear against the night. At 01:53, the battalion communications officer made a brief note in the radio log. Signal interruption. No incoming traffic. This, too, was not unusual. Radios froze. Batteries failed. Antennas snapped under ice. What followed, however, did not fit any known pattern. By 02:00, forward observers across the sector began reporting the same sensation, though no one yet had words for it. The battlefield felt empty. Not quiet, empty. Normally, even in pauses between engagements, the front breathed. Somewhere, an engine coughed. Metal creaked as frozen equipment shifted. A distant rifle cracked. The wind carried echoes from places you could not see. That night, there was nothing. Snow absorbed sound. This was understood even then. But snow alone could not explain why voices seemed to fall dead in the air, or why men standing shoulder to shoulder felt suddenly isolated, as if wrapped in thick cloth. At 02:07, a corporal fired a single round into the ground in front of the trench, a routine test meant to check for delayed enemy infiltration. Those closest to him felt the vibration through their boots. Several later stated they did not hear the shot. At 02:10, a runner attempted to relay an order down the trench line. Men watched him move. His boots sank into the snow. His breath fogged visibly in front of his face. No one heard him approach. No one heard him leave. At 02:15, the first helmet was removed. A private aged 21 pressed his gloved fingers against his ears, then removed his gloves and tried again with bare skin, grimacing as the cold bit immediately. He shook his head, then tapped the side of his helmet, as if testing a faulty machine. He mouthed something. Those around him could not hear it. They could see his lips moving. By 02:17, the battalion log recorded the moment officially. Multiple personnel report temporary loss of auditory perception. The phrasing was clinical. The experience was not. Men began speaking louder, then shouting. Some screamed. Others laughed nervously. But even raised voices seemed strangely muted, as though the sound never fully formed. One squad leader later wrote in a personal notebook recovered after the war. It was like speaking underwater. You knew you were making noise, but it did not belong to you anymore. At 02:23, hand signals replaced spoken orders entirely. This should have triggered panic. It did not. Instead, a different sensation spread, subtle, slow, and far more dangerous. Calm. Not confidence, not discipline, but a dull, flattening calm, like the emotional equivalent of snow filling every hollow. Most of the men in the sector had not slept properly in at least 40 hours. Rations had been inconsistent since February 13th, with hot food last delivered 4 days earlier. Frostbite cases were already being recorded nightly. Several soldiers were suffering from mild hypothermia, even before the silence began. Under these conditions, The human brain does not fail dramatically. It withdraws. At 02:31, a sentry on the eastern edge of the trench system was observed standing at his post, rifle slung, staring into the fog. At 02:41, he was gone. His weapon was found moments later, leaning carefully against the sandbags. The snow around the position showed no signs of struggle, no drag marks, no chaotic movement. Only his footprints, clear, well-defined, leading away from the trench. They extended approximately 9 meters. Then they stopped, as if the man had simply ceased to exist. A patrol was assembled immediately. 3 men moved out cautiously, keeping visual contact with the trench behind them. They advanced no more than 20 meters before returning abruptly. They had seen nothing. They had heard nothing. One of them was shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but from something else he could not articulate. Between 02:45 and 03 hour, 2 more men left their positions. No alarm was raised, no shout was heard. They were simply noticed to be absent. By 03:10, the commanding officer ordered all personnel to remain within the trench perimeter. The order had to be passed by touch and gesture, moving from man to man like a silent chain. Several soldiers later admitted they felt an overwhelming urge to walk out into the fog. Not to flee, not to desert, just to go. The calm deepened. Medical science in 1943 had limited language for what was happening. Terms like combat fatigue and shell shock existed, but they did not fully explain the combination of sensory loss, emotional detachment, and behavioral drift occurring that night. Modern psychology would recognize the pattern immediately: psychogenic deafness, dissociation, severe combat exhaustion compounded by extreme cold. At 29 degrees Celsius, the body prioritizes survival aggressively. Blood flow shifts. Reaction times slow by as much as 30%. Judgment degrades. Emotional processing narrows. Fear, normally the strongest survival signal, becomes muted. And when fear disappears, the battlefield becomes lethal in a new way. By 04, at least 6 men were unaccounted for. There had been no attack, no enemy contact, no gunfire, only silence. When dawn finally began to break at approximately 07:12 a.m., the fog lifted slightly. The snowfield beyond the trenches lay undisturbed, smooth, and pale under the weak winter light. No bodies were visible, no movement, no sound. The front would shift again within weeks. Reports would be filed. Losses would be attributed to exposure and psychological exhaustion. The war would continue without pause. But for those who survived that night, the memory never faded. They had faced artillery barrages that shook the earth. They had watched cities burn and men die screaming. Yet years later, many of them would say the same thing. The most frightening moment of the war was not when the guns roared. It was when everything went silent. The first mistake was to assume the silence was environmental. Snow had always changed the soundscape of the front. Every soldier knew this. Fresh snowfall could soften footsteps. Fog could bend distance. Cold air could carry echoes in strange directions. None of this was new. What happened after 02:17 a.m. did not fit those explanations. Normally, even under heavy snow, sound behaved predictably. Rifles cracked sharply. Commands echoed down trench walls. Engines carried for kilometers in frozen air. On clear winter nights, sound often traveled farther, not less. That night, it collapsed inward. Men later struggled to describe it, but several accounts used the same phrasing. The sound didn't travel. It stayed inside your head. Between 02:20 and 02:35, at least 11 separate reports of auditory disturbance were logged across the sector. These were not written as panic reports. They were short, factual observations, noted by exhausted officers who had seen too much already to dramatize anything. One entry read, "Voices difficult to perceive beyond close proximity." Another, "Auditory response inconsistent. Personnel rely on visual signals. At SO-228, a flare was fired vertically from a support trench to test visibility and reaction. The flare burned normally. Its light reflected off the snowfield. Men saw it clearly. What they did not hear was the expected crack of ignition or the hiss of its descent. Several soldiers reported feeling a faint pressure change in their chests, a physical sensation without sound. This detail would later appear again and again in testimonies. The body felt vibration. The ears received nothing. By 0230, communication discipline broke down. Orders that should have taken seconds now took minutes. Messages were relayed by touch, a hand on a shoulder, a finger pointed left or right. Runners moved constantly, but their movement felt unreal, ghost-like, as if detached from cause and effect. At 0234, one lieutenant attempted to restore verbal command, ordering a full roll call by squad. The attempt failed. Men opened their mouths. They could see each other speaking. Lips moved, faces tensed, breath fogged in the cold air. But the sound either arrived delayed, distorted, or not at all. Several soldiers later admitted something that never appeared in official reports. They stopped trying to hear. The brain, under extreme stress, seeks efficiency. When sensory input becomes unreliable, it does not fight endlessly to restore it. It reallocates resources elsewhere. In this case, the auditory channel simply shut down. This phenomenon had been observed before, though rarely described clearly during the war. Military doctors had encountered soldiers who could not hear after bombardment, despite having undamaged ears. They called it functional deafness. It was understood as temporary, psychological, and inconvenient, not dangerous. That assumption would prove fatal. Between 0235 and 03, the silence began to alter behavior. Men stopped whispering, stopped swearing, stopped reacting to sudden movement. Normally, even the smallest noise at night caused tension. A rifle raised, a body stiffening. Now, movements passed without response. One survivor later said, "Nothing startled me. That was when I knew something was wrong." At 0241, the disappearance of the first sentry was confirmed. His post was checked initially because no response came when a runner attempted to pass behind him. The runner had to physically tap another soldier to get his attention, a detail that appeared repeatedly in later interviews. Touch worked. Sound did not. The missing soldier's rifle was cold to the touch, suggesting it had been left no more than 10 minutes earlier. There were no signs of haste. His gloves were not left behind. His helmet was not dropped. Everything suggested a calm, deliberate departure. The footprints told a similar story. They were evenly spaced, not running, not stumbling. They led away from the trench in a straight line toward the fog-covered open ground. After approximately 9 meters, they stopped abruptly. Not scattered, not disturbed. Simply ended. This was not possible in a literal sense. Snow does not erase footprints instantly. Wind that night was minimal. No fresh snowfall had occurred in the last 40 minutes. And yet, there they were, clear tracks that ended without transition. At 0247, a patrol of 3 men was ordered forward. They advanced slowly, maintaining visual contact with the trench behind them. They reported an immediate sensation of disorientation upon leaving the trench line. A flattening of depth perception, as if distance had lost meaning. After moving approximately 15 meters, the patrol leader halted the group. He later stated, "I felt like if we went farther, we wouldn't come back." They returned without finding anything. By 03, 2 more absences were noted. Again, no alarm was heard, no cries, no rifle fire. The men were simply gone. At this point, command discipline should have imposed strict control. Under normal circumstances, this kind of unexplained loss would have triggered aggressive containment measures. Instead, hesitation crept in. Not because of fear, but because fear was no longer functioning correctly. Medical understanding today explains why. Severe combat fatigue, combined with hypothermia and sleep deprivation, can blunt the amygdala, the brain's fear processing center. When this happens, danger no longer registers emotionally. Decisions are made without urgency. Risk assessment collapses. In 1943, this was not understood. What officers saw instead were men who appeared calm, cooperative, and emotionally flat. At 03:12, one sergeant was observed sitting on the firing step, staring into the snow, his rifle resting across his knees. When approached, he looked up and smiled faintly. He did not respond to spoken questions. When tapped on the shoulder, he blinked, as if waking from a dream. Later examination showed no injury, no frostbite, no sign of concussion, only exhaustion. By 03:30, the disappearance count reached 5. By 04, it was 6. All vanished in silence. No enemy contact was reported throughout the entire night. As dawn approached, the temperature dropped further, reaching 31 degrees shortly before sunrise. Cold, fatigue, and sensory shutdown reinforced each other in a closed loop. Men remained at their posts, not because they were alert, but because movement itself felt unnecessary. One officer later summarized the experience in a post-war interview. It was not terror. It was worse. It was the absence of the instinct to survive. When first light finally crept over the snowfields at 07:12 a.m., visibility improved slightly. The fog thinned but did not fully lift. Search parties were organized cautiously. They found no bodies, no dropped equipment beyond what had already been recovered, no signs of combat, only snow, smooth, untouched snow, and the knowledge that something essential had failed inside the men who had walked away. The silence had not been a condition of the battlefield. It had been a condition of the mind. The disappearances did not stop with daylight. This was the detail that troubled commanders most when reports were later reviewed. Night losses could be attributed, at least formally, to confusion, enemy patrols, or environmental exposure. Daylight erased those excuses. On the morning of February 17, 1943, at 0840, a head count confirmed 6 missing men from the sector. Their names were recorded, their units noted, their absence categorized as unconfirmed losses. The front was quiet that day. Not silent, quiet in the ordinary sense. Sporadic rifle fire resumed by midday. Artillery sounded faintly from several kilometers away. The men who could hear again described sound returning unevenly, as if filtered through cotton. Medical personnel recorded 9 cases of partial or total auditory loss that morning. In 7 of them, hearing returned within 6 to 12 hours. In 2, it took more than 3 days. None showed physical injury. By evening, the silence of the previous night was treated as an anomaly. Disturbing, but passed. That assumption lasted less than 12 hours. February 18, 1943, 1:10 a.m. The second night began colder. Temperature readings taken at a nearby supply point recorded 30.5 degrees Celsius shortly after midnight. Wind was minimal. Snowfall light but continuous, adding another 3 to 4 centimeters to the ground. At 01:10, a platoon runner failed to report back from a routine perimeter check. At 01:27, his absence was noted. At 01:40, his rifle was found resting against a tree trunk approximately 22 meters from the trench line. Again, no signs of struggle, no discarded equipment, no erratic tracks. His footprints were visible for 12 meters, then nothing. By 02, 2 more men were missing. What distinguished this night from the first was not the silence, though sound was again muted, but the behavior of those who remained. Men did not react quickly. Roll calls were delayed. Orders had to be repeated physically. In several cases, soldiers acknowledged commands by nodding, then failed to carry them out. One officer wrote in a memo dated February 19th, "Personnel appear compliant but disconnected. Orders are understood intellectually but lack urgency." Between February 17th and February 26th, the sector recorded 18 disappearances. The pattern was consistent. All occurred during late night or early morning hours. None occurred under direct enemy fire. None involved visible panic. None left behind signs of resistance. Most alarming of all, no one reported hearing anyone leave. Survivors struggled to explain why the men left. There were no shouted arguments, no visible breakdowns, no dramatic gestures. Those who walked away did not appear frightened. Several witnesses described a similar image. A man standing quietly, looking into the fog or darkness, then stepping forward. One private recalled watching his bunkmate leave at approximately 03:20 on February 20th. He didn't look back. He wasn't sneaking. He just stood up and walked like he was going somewhere familiar. Another soldier described an almost identical scene 2 nights later. The men did not run. They did not stumble. They did not call out. This detail ruled out panic-induced flight. Panic produces noise, haste, chaos. What happened here was slow and deliberate. Medical interpretation today would classify this as dissociative behavior under extreme stress. At the time, it was simply recorded as inexplicable. Patrols were sent out repeatedly. Between February 18th and February 25th, 11 patrols attempted to trace the missing. None advanced beyond 40 meters from the trench line. The reason was not enemy contact. It was orientation failure. Patrol leaders consistently reported difficulty judging distance, a sensation of spatial flattening, loss of depth perception, a feeling of being watched without seeing anything. One patrol report noted, ground appears uniform, direction difficult to maintain, no auditory reference points. In snow-covered terrain at night, sound is critical for orientation. Without it, even trained soldiers lose their internal sense of position. Several patrol members later admitted something privately. They felt an urge to keep walking. Not curiosity, not fear, but a sense that stopping was unnecessary. One non-commissioned officer stated years later, "If the lieutenant hadn't ordered us back, I think we would have gone on until we collapsed." By February 21st, medical staff began to recognize a pattern. Men brought in for auditory complaints often displayed additional symptoms. Slowed speech, delayed responses, emotional flatness, reduced pain sensitivity. Pulse rates were slightly lowered. Reflexes intact but sluggish. None showed signs of frostbite severe enough to explain behavior. The cold, however, played a decisive role. At temperatures below 28 degrees, cognitive performance degrades measurably. Studies conducted decades later would show decision-making speed reduced by 20–30%, emotional response blunted, increased dissociation. Combined with sleep deprivation and combat fatigue, this created a perfect psychological trap. Fear normally prevents irrational movement. Here, fear was gone. The final disappearance occurred on February 26, 1943, at approximately 04:10 a.m. A corporal assigned to watch duty failed to respond during a scheduled check. His post was less than 5 meters from 2 other soldiers. Neither heard him leave. His footprints extended 7 meters into open ground. They ended cleanly. By dawn, the front command ordered no further night patrols beyond the trench perimeter. Personnel were instructed, unusually, to remain in pairs at all times after dark. The order arrived too late for 18 men. When the sector was abandoned in early March 1943, the disappearances were closed administratively. The final summary used neutral language. Losses attributed to environmental exposure, disorientation, and psychological exhaustion. No individual investigations followed. No recovery operations were conducted. The war demanded momentum, not answers. Years later, survivors consistently agreed on one thing. No enemy had taken those men. No trap had been sprung. Nothing chased them. They walked away because in that moment, nothing inside them told them to stay. The battlefield did not need to kill them. It only needed them to stop caring whether they lived. The calm arrived quietly, not as relief, not as courage, but as a gradual flattening of everything that once mattered. By February 18th, medical personnel attached to the sector began to notice a shift that did not fit the usual rhythm of frontline exhaustion. Men were reporting symptoms, but they were doing so without urgency. They did not complain loudly. They did not demand attention. Several had to be physically guided into the aid station because they did not respond when called. One medic noted the time, 09:15 a.m., and wrote, "Patient cooperative, alert, emotionally indifferent." This line would appear repeatedly over the next 9 days. Indifferent. In combat zones, indifference is rare. Even the most exhausted soldiers usually retain some edge: irritation, fear, aggression. Here, those reactions were muted or absent altogether. The men sat where they were told to sit. They answered questions when asked directly. They did not ask questions themselves. Their bodies were present. Their attention was not. Between February 18th and February 24th, field medics documented 27 cases of what they classified as functional disorders. These included temporary auditory loss, slowed motor response, emotional blunting, diminished reaction to pain. In 14 cases, the soldiers displayed all 4 symptoms simultaneously. None showed physical trauma, frostbite beyond mild surface exposure, signs of concussion. Vital signs were largely normal. Body temperatures hovered low, but within survivable ranges, typically 35.0–35.8 degrees C, consistent with prolonged cold exposure rather than acute hypothermia. The contradiction troubled the medical staff. Physiologically, these men should have been anxious, agitated, or panicked. They were not. One assistant surgeon wrote in a letter dated February 22nd, "They behave as though danger has been postponed indefinitely." What was happening inside their minds was not understood in 1943, but modern neuroscience provides a clear explanation. Under sustained stress, the human brain prioritizes survival by conserving energy. Prolonged exposure to extreme cold, sleep deprivation, constant threat forces the nervous system into a defensive mode. In this state, the amygdala, the structure responsible for processing fear, becomes less responsive. Emotional signals weaken. Urgency dissolves. The world feels distant. This is not peace. It is neurological shutdown. At temperatures below 28 degrees C, neural transmission slows. Reaction times degrade. Decision-making becomes linear and narrow. Complex emotional processing, such as fear, anticipation, and moral reasoning, requires energy the body no longer wants to spend. The result is calm, a dangerous calm. Years later, survivors struggled to explain the sensation. One infantryman described it like this: "I remember thinking that nothing bad could happen right now. That thought alone should have terrified me. It didn't." Another recalled sitting in the trench at 03 a.m., watching snow fall. "I felt warm. That was impossible, but I felt it anyway." This false sense of warmth is a known prelude to fatal exposure. It often appears alongside emotional detachment, encouraging people to stop moving, to sit down, to rest. In the context of a battlefield, it becomes lethal. This calm explains why men left their positions without resistance. Walking requires intention. Panic produces erratic movement. Discipline produces controlled action. This produced neither. Instead, it created what medics later described as goalless motion. Men stood up, not because they were ordered to. They stood up because remaining seated felt unnecessary. One survivor described the impulse. "It wasn't a decision. It was like remembering something I had forgotten." The brain, stripped of fear and urgency, no longer recognized the trench as safety. Open ground no longer registered as danger. The fog did not conceal threats. It concealed responsibility. In that state, movement felt neutral, and neutrality in a war zone is fatal. Commanders sensed something was wrong, but they lacked a framework to act decisively. Men were not disobedient. They were not insubordinate. They were not hysterical. They simply failed to care in the way soldiers must care to survive. Attempts to restore discipline through routine measures failed. Raised voices had little effect. Physical reprimands were unnecessary. The men were compliant, just detached. One officer noted, "They follow instructions as if rehearsing, not as if believing." This detachment eroded unit cohesion faster than fear ever could. Auditory deprivation intensified everything. Sound anchors human awareness. It provides spatial orientation, emotional cues, and a sense of continuity. When sound disappears or becomes unreliable, the brain loses a key reference point. Several men whose hearing returned later described a sudden emotional collapse. One soldier reported breaking down in tears when he heard artillery again at 11:20 a.m. on February 19th. "I didn't realize how empty everything had been until the noise came back." The silence had not just muted the battlefield. It had muted them. What made this episode uniquely deadly was not any single factor. It was the convergence of four conditions. 1. Extreme cold, slowing cognition. Sleep deprivation, impairing judgment. Combat fatigue, blunting emotional response. 4. Auditory disruption, erasing orientation. Each alone was survivable. Together, they produced men who could no longer recognize danger, even when standing inside it. In retrospect, the signs were clear. Men who smiled inappropriately. Men who failed to react to sudden movement. Men who expressed peace instead of fear. Today, such symptoms would trigger immediate evacuation. In 1943, they were interpreted as resilience, or worse, discipline. The calm was mistaken for strength. It was not. It was the moment the survival instinct had begun to shut down. Of the 18 men who disappeared, none were officially recovered. No remains were documented. No equipment was found beyond the immediate perimeter. Exposure likely killed them within hours. Not because the cold was unusually cruel, but because they no longer felt a reason to resist it. One surviving medic summarized the experience decades later in a recorded interview. "They did not die screaming. They did not die running. They died because their minds told them everything was finally quiet." The battlefield did not overwhelm them. It emptied them. The doctors were not unprepared. They were simply working with the wrong century. By the morning of February 18th, medical staff attached to the sector had already treated hundreds of cases related to cold exposure, exhaustion, and shell shock. Frostbite, trench foot, concussions. These were familiar problems with established protocols. What they encountered after the silent nights did not fit those categories. At 09:40 a.m., the first soldier presenting complete auditory loss was examined in a forward aid dugout. His ears were clean. No blood, no rupture, no inflammation. When a metal instrument was struck sharply less than a meter from his head, he flinched, not at the sound, but at the movement. The vibration registered, the noise did not. The examining medic noted, "Auditory apparatus intact, no organic cause detected." This phrasing, "no organic cause," would appear 23 times in medical summaries over the next 2 weeks. In 1943, battlefield medicine understood trauma as something physical. Shell shock was acknowledged, but poorly defined. Psychological injury was still framed as weakness, hysteria, or moral failure, rather than neurological overload. There was no concept of stress-induced sensory shutdown, dissociative withdrawal, trauma-related perceptual filtering. Doctors knew what they were seeing. They did not know why. One senior medic wrote in frustration on February 20th, "The patient responds to stimuli, yet reports absence of perception. There is no lesion to treat. Medicine without a lesion is helpless. Standard procedures were applied methodically. Men with auditory loss were warmed gradually, hydrated, fed concentrated rations, ordered to rest. Some were exposed to loud noises in controlled attempts to restart hearing. Metal, struck against metal, shouted commands, even a pistol fired outside the tent. Results varied. Of the 27 documented cases, 11 regained partial hearing within 6 hours, 9 within 24 hours, 5 within 3 days, 2 showed no improvement before evacuation. In none of these cases did treatment directly correlate with recovery. Hearing returned when it returned, or it did not. This randomness disturbed the medical staff more than the condition itself. More troubling than deafness was what doctors couldn't provoke: fear. Pain response was reduced. Men flinched less. Some did not react at all to needle pricks that should have produced immediate withdrawal. When asked about the disappearances, many responded with indifference. One patient, when told that his bunkmate was missing, nodded and said, "That happens." No visible distress followed. Another responded, "It's quiet now." Doctors attempted to re-anchor patients emotionally by discussing home, family, or previous life events. These techniques sometimes worked in cases of shell shock. Here, they failed. Men listened politely. They did not reconnect. Officially, most cases were labeled as functional auditory disorder, temporary exhaustion state, combat fatigue. These labels were administratively convenient. They were also dangerously incomplete. What was happening was not temporary tiredness. It was a shutdown of survival signaling. The brain, overwhelmed and deprived of sensory input, had entered a low-energy preservation mode. Fear, metabolically expensive, was suppressed. Doctors could warm bodies. They could not restart instinct. Modern neuroscience explains what the doctors could not know. Under prolonged stress, the nervous system shifts from sympathetic activation, fight or flight, to dorsal vagal dominance, a state associated with shutdown, dissociation, and emotional numbness. In simple terms, the body stops trying to escape. It tries to endure. In extreme cold and isolation, this endurance becomes fatal. The men were not resisting treatment. They were not refusing help. Their systems no longer prioritized survival. One case was documented in more detail than the others. A private, age 22, admitted on February 21st, with complete auditory loss and emotional flatness. He had been found sitting on a firing step at 04:30 a.m., staring at the snow. He responded to written questions. When asked if he felt afraid, he wrote, "I don't think so." When asked if he wanted to sleep, he wrote, "There's time." His hearing returned partially on February 24th. His emotional response did not. He was evacuated to a rear unit on March 1st. No further records exist. Privately, some medics admitted something they never wrote down. They felt uneasy around these men. Not because they were violent, but because they were absent. One nurse later recalled, "They looked at you as if you were very far away." This absence was contagious. Several medical staff reported sleep disturbances and anxiety after extended exposure to these patients, an early example of secondary trauma, though unrecognized at the time. By March 4, 1943, the sector was dissolved and absorbed into a reorganized front line. Medical records were closed. The final medical summary stated, "Condition resolved or stabilized in most cases. No further intervention required." This was technically true. Most men regained hearing. What they did not regain was recorded nowhere. Fear, urgency, the instinct that tells a man to stay alive when no one is watching. One surviving doctor would later write, in a letter never published, "We treated what we could measure. What killed them could not be measured at all." The battlefield did not defeat the doctors. Time did, ignorance did, and the silence did, by erasing the very signals medicine depended on. When the front moved on in early March 1943, it did not do so ceremonially. There was no final engagement, no decisive breakthrough, no moment that marked the end of what had happened in that sector. Orders arrived quietly, passed from staff officers to company commanders, then down to platoons already accustomed to silence. Positions were to be abandoned, trenches filled where possible. Equipment that could not be carried was to be destroyed or left behind. The line, unstable since January, was shifting again. On March 3rd, the last operational report from the sector was filed at 1820. It contained no mention of disappearances, only numbers, ammunition counts, frostbite cases, personnel strength reduced and reallocated. Losses were summarized in a single neutral phrase that appeared again and again in Eastern Front paperwork. Losses due to environmental exposure and psychological exhaustion. That line closed the matter. The 18 men who had walked away between February 17th and February 26th were never reclassified. They were not listed as killed in action. They were not listed as prisoners of war. Their names did not appear in casualty notifications sent to families. Administratively, they existed in a limbo that wartime bureaucracy tolerated because it had to. The front could not wait for clarity. When the snow began to melt in mid-March, no systematic searches were ordered. The ground beyond the former trench line softened, then turned to mud. Footprints vanished. Any bodies that might have been there were now beyond recovery without dedicated effort, and dedicated effort required justification. There was none. Officers who had served in the sector were reassigned. Medical staff rotated out. The makeshift aid stations were dismantled, their logs boxed and sent rearward, where they would be filed among thousands of similar reports from winter 1942-1943, a season already infamous for attrition that defied explanation. In those reports, the language was precise and empty. No anomalies, no unanswered questions, no reference to silence. The war had a way of flattening experience into acceptable categories, and what could not be categorized was simply pressed into the nearest available shape. Exposure, fatigue, disorientation. In the weeks that followed, scattered rumors circulated among nearby units. Soldiers spoke quietly about a place where men stopped hearing, where patrols refused to advance, where something in the night made it easy to leave and hard to stay. These stories never solidified into legend. They were too vague, too uncomfortable. They lacked an enemy to blame. By April, even the rumors faded. The ground where the trenches had been dug returned to an unremarkable state. Snowmelt erased outlines. Wind collapsed the remaining sandbags. By summer, tall grass and weeds covered most of the area. Without markers, without memorials, without coordinates worth preserving, the sector ceased to exist as a place of significance. This was common on the Eastern Front. Entire battles vanished into paperwork. Entire regiments were reduced to footnotes. What happened south of Voronezh in February 1943 was not exceptional in scale. It was exceptional in nature, and nature does not survive well in archives. In post-war years, when historians examined winter attrition reports from the region, they noted clusters of unexplained losses attributed to cold and exhaustion. They noted unusually high rates of temporary sensory impairment during periods of extreme weather. They did not connect these observations into a single narrative. There was no incentive to do so. The men who survived carried the connection themselves. Several veterans interviewed decades later described the same memory with striking consistency. They remembered dates. They remembered temperatures. They remembered the way sound returned unevenly, as if the world had been switched back on piece by piece. And they remembered something else, something that did not appear in any official record. They remembered realizing, sometimes years later, how close they had come to leaving. One former infantryman, interviewed in the late 1960s, said he only understood what had happened when he read about polar expeditions and cold-induced apathy. He recognized the descriptions immediately: the false calm, the sense that stopping was acceptable, the absence of fear. "I thought I had been brave," he said. "Now I know I had been empty." Another veteran recalled that after the war, loud, sudden noises made him feel relief rather than alarm. Artillery during training exercises, factory sirens, even thunder. Sound reassured him. Silence, on the other hand, made him restless in ways he could not explain. These testimonies never entered official histories. They belong to a category wartime narratives rarely accommodate. Moments when survival fails not because of violence, but because the mechanisms that enable survival quietly disengage. Modern medicine would later give names to what the doctors in 1943 could not fix. Psychogenic sensory loss, dissociation, nervous system shutdown under prolonged stress. Today, such symptoms would trigger immediate evacuation, warming protocols, psychiatric intervention. Back then, they were observed, recorded, and left behind. What happened in that sector did not require a supernatural explanation. It required only time, cold, exhaustion, and silence applied long enough to the human nervous system. The battlefield did not attack those men. It did not pursue them. It did not need to. It simply removed the signals that told them to stay. By the time the front moved on, the danger had already passed. Not because it had ended, but because it had completed its work. The war rolled westward, carrying with it noise, chaos, and the familiar violence soldiers understood how to endure. Behind it remained a stretch of ground where nothing remarkable had ever officially occurred. No marker stands there now. No sign warns what once happened. And that is fitting. Because the most dangerous thing that happened there left no trace at all. The war did not remember that place, but the men did. Years later, when winter returned and the world grew quiet in ordinary, harmless ways, some of them would feel it again. Not fear, not panic, but that same thinning of urgency that had crept in during February 1943, south of Voronezh, when the temperature dropped below 30 degrees C, and the guns fell silent for reasons no one could explain at the time. They would be standing in a snow-covered street, or lying awake at night, and suddenly, the absence of sound would feel heavy instead of peaceful. Not threatening. Worse than threatening. Persuasive. Those who survived never described monsters. They never spoke of shadows moving in the fog or voices calling them by name. There was nothing like that. What haunted them was far more difficult to explain, and far more difficult to forget. The realization that nothing had tried to kill them. Nothing had chased them. Nothing had even frightened them. The danger had arrived as relief. In 1943, the men who walked away did so without drama. They did not cry out. They did not run. They did not fight. Their rifles were left neatly behind. Their footprints were orderly. Their last known actions suggested intention, without purpose, motion without resistance. They stepped out of the trenches as if stepping out of a thought that had finally become unnecessary. This is why their disappearance never became legend. Legends need villains. They need violence. They need something external to point at and name. What happened there offered none of that. It offered only a quiet lesson about the human nervous system, under conditions it was never meant to endure for long. Extreme cold, prolonged fear, and finally, the removal of the very signals that tell a person they are in danger. Sound is one of those signals. It anchors us. It gives shape to space. It confirms that the world is still responding. When sound failed on that frozen front line, when voices stopped carrying, when shots lost their crack, when even footsteps vanished into the snow, the men did not simply lose hearing. They lost orientation. They lost urgency. And slowly, they lost the instinct that keeps a person alive when logic no longer applies. Modern medicine would later explain this with precision. Terms would be introduced, pathways mapped, theories refined. But none of that changes what happened to those 18 men between February 17 and February 26, 1943. None of it changes the fact that they were not defeated by an enemy, nor overcome by panic, nor broken by pain. They were emptied. And emptiness is difficult to fight. The battlefield itself left no trace. No marker stands where the trenches once cut through the snow. No sign warns passers-by that something unusual occurred there. Spring came. The ground softened. Grass grew. By summer, the land looked like any other stretch of earth that had survived the war simply by being forgotten. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. In post-war interviews conducted decades later, some veterans struggled to explain why silence unsettled them more than noise, why sudden loud sounds brought relief instead of alarm, why they avoided places where snow fell thick and undisturbed, where voices carried poorly, where the world felt padded and distant. They did not say they were afraid of dying. They said they were afraid of not caring whether they lived. One man admitted that during a particularly quiet night in the 1960s, long after the war had ended, he stood on his porch listening to snowfall and felt the same calm he had felt in the trench. The same soft certainty that everything was finally simple. He went inside immediately and turned on the radio, just to hear something, anything, break the silence. That reaction makes sense now. Silence, when combined with exhaustion and cold, is not neutral. It is an active force. It invites the nervous system to shut down, to conserve, to withdraw. In normal life, that response passes unnoticed. In war, it can be fatal. The men who walked away did not make a mistake. Their bodies did exactly what overstressed human bodies sometimes do. They stopped sending warning signals. They stopped spending energy on fear. They stopped insisting on survival. The war did not need to kill them after that. It only needed to remain quiet. This is why the story matters, even now. Not because it reveals a hidden horror of the battlefield, but because it exposes something far more unsettling. That under certain conditions, the most dangerous thing a human being can lose is not strength, not discipline, not even hope, but urgency. When urgency disappears, death does not have to arrive violently. It can wait. It can be patient. It can let a person walk toward it willingly, calmly, convinced that nothing important is being left behind. On the Eastern Front in 1943, that lesson was written in snow and then erased by spring. It survives only in scattered reports, unfinished records, and memories that never found the right words. The battlefield did not roar that night. It whispered nothing at all. And for some men, that was enough.